Talk about that. So we're going to talk about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and Reconstruction of the South. Our first subtopic is the post-war South. That means what the South looked like after the Civil War. And you can imagine when the firing of the Civil War stopped, the South looked pretty dismal. Matter of fact, very dismal. The South had completely collapsed, both economically and socially. The South had completely collapsed, both economically and socially. I'll give an example of two beautiful cities that were simply gutted and in ruins. Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia. Two very beautiful cities, Charleston, South Carolina, and Richmond, Virginia, that were basically totally gutted and in ruins after the Civil War. Atlanta was another city that was totally gutted and in ruins. And there's a historic quote from a man who once lived in Atlanta, who came back to Atlanta right after the Civil War, and he was quoted as saying, "Hell has laid her egg, and right here it hatched." So one guy from Atlanta, Georgia, returned to the town he once lived in and witnessed what it looked like after the Civil War, and he was quoted as saying, "Hell has laid her egg, and right here it hatched." Hell has laid her egg, and right here it's hatched. Now, the Civil War really left its mark on three specific areas of the South. And I don't mean geographical areas, I mean areas of importance in the South. And the first were Southern social institutions. So the Civil War left its mark on three specific areas of the South. The first being Southern social institutions. Anybody want to give me an example of how the Civil War left its brutal mark on Southern social institutions? What is a social institution? You're sitting in one this morning. School. And one example of Southern social institutions being horribly affected by the Civil War is that the educational system in the South was in chaos. What do you think happened to the schools that were there? Destroyed. How about the teachers that taught in those schools? What happened to them? Many of them. Dead, killed, either in battle or as a civilian casualty. So one example of Southern social institutions being negatively affected by the Civil War was that the educational system of the South was in chaos. Schools were destroyed, teachers were killed in battle, or maybe civilian casualties such as Mary in the movie. What's another social institution? You might go there this weekend if you're good. Churches. Okay, churches are social institutions. And they also were battered and left in ruins. So if someone had a spiritual way about them, like which most did, and you were a churchgoer, where were you going to go to church in the South? There weren't any. They were all destroyed. A lot of the people that ran the churches were killed or lives affected dramatically in the Civil War. So there's your first area of the South that the Civil War left its mark, and some examples. The second specific area was economic life in the South. Economic life in the South. How about an example of how economic life in the South was affected negatively by the Civil War? What can you think of? If you're living in Atlanta after the Civil War and need a loaf of bread, where are you going to get it? Yeah, well, if they had one, but that's the point. Stores, businesses, and banks had to lock their doors. If they weren't destroyed by the war physically, they were ruined by the inflation. So banks and businesses locked their doors if they had doors to lock after the Civil War. There's one example. What gives businesses their products? Where does the business, what's that? Well, and where do merchants get their products? Ports. Well, where do farmers send their things? Factories. Any factories in the South that produced goods, if they weren't ruined, they were smokeless and silent. In other words, anything that survived wasn't running. So you have no businesses or banks because you have no factories who are receiving goods from merchants and farmers to produce goods for the businesses. Okay? Now, how do farmers get their goods to the factories or merchants to the factories? Transportation. Well, the transportation system in the South was broken down completely. What did Union, and you saw it in the movie, what were people doing even in the South and in the North? What were the opposite sides doing to the railroad lines? Destroyed them so they couldn't bring supplies to the whichever group you were bringing supplies to. So the railroads were torn up in the South. The transportation system broken down completely. So those 3 examples of how economic life in the South was affected. And our final area of the South that was affected negatively by the Civil War was Southern agriculture. Southern agriculture. What was the big crop that was grown in the South that was most prosperous? Cotton. So, now first example. The once white cotton fields, all they were growing after the Civil War was a great harvest of what? Weeds. Yeah. So the once white cotton fields are now full of weeds. What else might you need to make the cotton fields work that was no longer existent? Slavery. The slave labor was gone because of the Emancipation Proclamation and the fact that the North won the Civil War. Now, what do you need to plant cotton? Seeds. And seeds were very scarce after the Civil War. So you have the cotton fields growing weeds. You have the slave labor gone. You have very scarce seed supply. And what else might you need to be a successful farmer in the South besides seed and cotton and hemp? Well, before machinery. What? Livestock. Very good. Livestock is all gone. Because what did the North do to all the Southern livestock? Killed it. Okay, so there was no livestock, there was no slave labor, there was no seeds, and the cotton fields were bare, full of weeds. So those are some examples of what the South looked like after the Civil War. And it's going to be Lincoln's plan for the South that's going to fix that. That's what we're going to talk about. Unfortunately, Lincoln's plan for the South is going to be a good plan, but it's never going to be enacted because of his assassination. So let's talk about Lincoln, President Lincoln's plan for the South. He's got all kinds of things he's got to get fixed up, and he's going to get some opposition also. Now, when Lincoln is developing a plan for the reconstruction of the South, he's got to deal with 2 different entities. He's got to deal with Southern citizens and Southern states. Okay? Because these states seceded from the Union, did they not? And these Southerners broke their loyalty away from the Union as well. So Lincoln's got to deal, first of all, with both Southern citizens and Southern states, and how is he going to bring those groups back into the Union? Because right now, are they in the Union? No. We'll talk about Southern citizens first. What was Lincoln's plan for the South concerning Southern citizens? And what he did is he offered something called amnesty to certain Southerners. Anybody know what amnesty is? Another word for that? He did what to them? He starts with a P. Pardoned them. Amnesty is a pardon. So for individual citizens, President Lincoln offered amnesty. I think it's on your ID sheet, is it not? And what amnesty is, it's a full pardon. But he only gave it to certain Southerners, not all Southerners. And we'll get to that in a minute. Now, what do you think the citizens were going to be required to do to get amnesty? They were going to have to do what? Well, pledge what? Their allegiance back to the Union. They were going to have to take an oath of allegiance. And those of you that are watched the outlaw Josie Wales, remember they had them put up their hand and take the allegiance? That's the oath. So if you were a Southern citizen, you would be required to take an oath of allegiance to the Union. which meant that you would accept their what? Accept the unions or laws. And what did those laws include? The abolishment of slavery. So to get back into the Union, you had to take an oath of allegiance to the Union, which stated that you would obey all Union federal laws, including the abolishment of slavery. You would have to understand fully that you could not have slaves. Now, I said that Lincoln gave amnesty to certain Southerners. So there were some Southern citizens that were not given amnesty. Who do you think those people were? Who did Lincoln not give amnesty to that were Southerners?
Seceded states.
We're talking about states. Now, don't get to states yet. We'll get to that. What individuals were not allowed amnesty? What's that? Very good. The leaders covers really two things. First of all, citizens who resigned their positions in the federal government to serve in the Confederate government were not given amnesty. So he's really hitting two things with leaders here. Okay? So I'll repeat that again. Citizens who resigned their positions, in other words, citizens who worked for the federal government prior to the Civil War, who resigned their positions and went and worked in the Confederate government, were not giving amnesty. In other words, if a senator from Atlanta, or a senator from Georgia, who was a senator in our normal Senate, resigned that Senate position and went in and became some part of the Confederate government during the Civil War, he was not given amnesty. So if anybody that worked for the federal government who resigned and went to work for the Confederate government were not given amnesty. What about the other part of Buck's leadership? What other type of citizens weren't giving amnesty that were leaders? Military officers, high-ranking military officers in the Confederate Army were not given amnesty, which means who did not get amnesty? Robert E. Lee. Okay? So, citizens who served as high-ranking officers in the Confederate Army. The third citizen that did not get it had to do with Luke Geiser. Okay? What type of person wouldn't get amnesty from Lincoln? What? People that treated prisoners of war unfairly or brutally. Okay? So citizens who mistreated prisoners of war were not given amnesty. Okay? So in Luke, now this is an opposite thing because Luke is from the South, but if you were a northern soldier and you were treated poorly in a southern prison camp, which they were, the person that ran that prison camp probably wouldn't have been given amnesty because he treated prisoners of war poorly. So that's how Lincoln handled the citizen part of this. Okay? Now, if you don't get amnesty, what do you get? Yeah, you get in trouble. You get probably jail time. Okay? Because you went against the Union. Now, keep in plan, this is Lincoln's plan at this point. Okay? Now, what did Lincoln do about southern states? This is kind of interesting. He made it pretty simple. Do you think he wanted those southern states back in the Union? You bet he did. He wanted to unite this nation back, so he did not make it very hard to get back in the Union. Here it is, and I want you just to listen this before you write it down. Basically, one criteria. Lincoln declared that in order for a southern state to return to the Union, it must do this. The southern state must show that 10% of the citizens that lived in that state who voted in the election of 1860, which was prior to the Civil War, would pledge their allegiance to the Union. So this is the state of AP history. I would come in here and say, all of you Southerners, that you all voted in the election of 1860, doesn't matter who you voted for, if 10% of you, or 2.6 or 3, if 3 of you in this room will stand up and take that oath of allegiance to the Union, I will let the entire AP history back in. That's what he said. That's pretty simple terms, isn't it? So that was the deal with states. He said if you can get 10% of your population who voted in the election of 1860 to pledge their allegiance to the Union, that state could come back into the Union. So if you make a comparison in this classroom, 3 of you would have to stand up in front of God Almighty and pledge your allegiance, and 23 of you wouldn't have to do that because you're still mad about things, but he still would let the state of AP U.S. history into the Union. So is he being pretty generous there? Yeah, because he wants these states back. Okay? Well, there was a group of Republican leaders that did not agree with Lincoln's plan for the South, and they were known as the Radical Republicans. And we're going to talk about what they did when they heard about Lincoln's plan.
What year was the election that they had?
1860. That was the election that Lincoln was elected president. Okay? So we'll talk about the Republican leaders that did not agree with Lincoln's plan for the South, and that group will become known in history as the Radical Republicans. Now, what were they most upset about, do you think? The citizens or the states? They weren't that upset about it. I mean, they understood you got to get the states back together, but these bastards that bear armed against our country, oh my God, we're not supporting any pardons. Okay, we're not supporting those guys. Then when they pardon them and let them back in, what are they going to be able to do when we let them back in? We let them back in the Union, what are they going to have the right to do? Vote. And they're even going to have the right to hold office, right? If they get voted into an office, right? Well, these Radical Republicans thought that was ridiculous. They opposed the idea of pardoning former Confederates and not allowing them, once they were back in the Union, to vote and hold office. And again, these Republicans were known as Radical Republicans. And the two most notable Radical Republicans that stood out against Lincoln were Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Those were the two Radical Republicans that were most boisterous against Lincoln's plan. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. And the difference between the two are one serves in the Senate and one serves in the House. Okay? So, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Now, each had their own reasons for not liking Lincoln's plan. I'll tell you what Charles Sumner, his philosophy was. His whole concern was that of the new black Americans. Okay, would he be in support of black Americans or oppose them? He's a senator from Massachusetts. Is he going to be for them or against them? Very much for them, right? Now, he insisted on two things concerning black Americans. One, he wanted to guarantee the legal equality of black Americans. He wanted to guarantee the legal equality of black Americans. He wanted black Americans to be of equal of white Americans. That's kind of a unique thought back in that time, isn't it? But that's what he did. He insisted on measures to guarantee the legal equality of black Americans. What else might be? He was concerned about the black American getting their freedom and being able to function. So what did he insist on that they receive so they could be productive citizens now that they're free? Which most of them didn't have. An education. Okay? So the second thing he insisted on concerning black Americans, that we educate these former slaves and their families to prepare them for the responsibility of being free. They can't, they got to be educated to survive, to be able to get jobs, etc. So Senator Charles Sumner insisted on two things concerning black Americans. One, he insisted on measures to guarantee the legal equality of black Americans. And two, he insisted on the education of former slaves to prepare them for the responsibilities of freedom. Now, Senator Thaddeus Stevens, he was all about punishing the South. He did not like the South. And he really wanted to punish the South. And he was simply mad about the injustices and the discriminations that black Americans faced during slavery. He was very upset about how they were treated. And so this, along with the fact that they didn't think that individuals should get into the Union so easily, this opposition by the radical Republicans to Lincoln's plan ended up in a congressional bill. Or a bill is something that they're going to try to pass into law. So Congress sends a bill up for passage that's going to be in opposition to Lincoln's plan. And this bill will become known as the Wade-Davis Bill. The Wade-Davis Bill. So opposition to Lincoln's plan grew. Eventually this opposition resulted in a congressional bill. And this bill became known in history as the Wade-Davis Bill. And basically what the Wade-Davis Bill did is it called for stronger measures for a southern state to be put into the Union. Now, the Wade-Davis Bill consisted of three things. One of them was what Lincoln stated. And what did Lincoln state it would take for a state to stay in the Union? 10% of each state citizens that voted in the election of 1860 had to pledge their allegiance. But they wanted more than that. The Wade-Davis Bill wanted two other things for a state to get in, other than just that simple 10% pledge. Because they thought that was a little bit too little. Now, we've kind of talked about the second thing that they put in there. They wanted the southern state, in order to get back into the Union, the southern state had to establish a new constitution that would recognize the freedom of what?